Yeah, I want to see if I can move the slide here. Yeah, let's see if I can move the slide. Oh, oh, sorry about that. Yeah, there you go. All good. Thank you. I go in there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Good morning. Good to see everybody here. We're going to continue on with our introduction to the parables of Jesus. And this morning, we're going to hopefully finish the introduction, and then we'll go into the actual study of the parables itself, likely next Sunday morning, Lord willing. And by way of the parables, do you know what book among Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John has the most parables in it? John? Luke? It is Luke. Luke has 24. Matthew has 23. Mark has 8. And John, depending on who you look at for your numbers, has 1 or 0, which I found very interesting. John emphasized more of the deity and the works of Jesus because the miracles would show confirming the word, and he is the word, John 1:1-3. And so that's kind of been normally accepted, but why there's not as many parables in there. Okay. So Luke has 24 parables. 18 are unique because, there's a lot of carryover there between the parables, between the Gospels, And so there are 18 unique ones to Luke. There are 11 unique ones only found in Matthew. A lot of those are Matthew 13. And there are 2 unique ones in Mark. And so when you combine all of this together, you get to a number around 40. Now, when you categorize these parables, now this is where we're at today. Let me get my notes moving. Here we go. Yep. Okay. There are several ways that the parables have been categorized. And so you see, as you see behind me, you have what could be called indirect communication. So that's where Jesus will not use the audience and say, you are this. Like in Matthew 5, where he says, you are the light of the world. He will not use you as the object of his teaching. It's going to be dealing with a third party, and then you look objectively at whatever is happening in that parable. Kind of like the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example. You have the priest, the Levite, and the Good Samaritan, and he's talking to a lawyer. Well, a lawyer's not any one of those 3 guys, and so he's going to use that as an indirect communication to try to show them as a third party looking in, what would you do if you were in this situation, and make them be open to the truth of whatever lesson it may be in the context of it, that is, that what would you do with the truth? And so how would you behave in these actions and such forth? And so the first way, though, is called indirect communication. Now, most of Jesus' parables, though, and we're going to go into this, are what you call double indirect. So that's not only just dealing with you, it's also dealing with me. Now, if you were to talk about, again, direct communication, that's when you're going to deal with the exact hearer and the subject at hand. And so the one that might be this one might be the parable of the treasure in the field. You might have been looking out the fields when he's talking about that. So that might be more of a direct communication. Now, when you think about the next categorization here on the similitude or the simile, this is where they use like or as. And so this is when you see, Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, or is like insert whatever it may be for that parable from Matthew 13, most likely. And so that's going to be a similitude, a simile. Now, there is a difference in a simile and a metaphor. Now, parables will have metaphors. What's a metaphor? You remember that from English class? What's a metaphor? Been a while. That's why I'm asking to get our definitions in play before I start going off in this thing for a few seconds. A metaphor is where you have, so if you say, well, I'm not going to use me because then that might degrade me a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar was called a fox. Was he really a fox? No. What was happening there? It's a metaphor. It's normally like a symbol. In that case, it would be an animal to represent the behaviors, in this case of Nebuchadnezzar, with what he's like in their eyes and how he's behaving. So that's a metaphor. Okay? So the parables do have some metaphoric aspects, but there are some differences here in the like or as category. So the simile is it merely states resemblance. So like. So the kingdom of heaven is like. So there is some resemblance to this. The metaphor, though, transfers the representation. And so that's another way to look at this is that the word metaphor means from an actual root word meta, which means beyond or over, and phyrene, which is to carry. So therefore we may call the figure a representation or a transference. Hence, the simile gently states that one thing is like or resembles another, and the metaphor boldly and warmly declares that one thing is the other. So the parables, though, do have some metaphoric aspects to it, and so we're going to bring that out a little bit later. I'm just going to set up the stage for it. The third category here, rather, is called the interrogative. Now, that's another English term. You ever been interrogated? I hope not, but you might have been. So if you brought into interrogation or you see it on TV, it's where they're going to ask you some questions. Where were you at? What are you doing? Who were you with? And so parables may have a similar thing. And so these sometimes, though, will lack plot development because it's all about more of the question than the actual. Well, it's all important, but it's just not as elaborated normally as, say, parable of the Good Samaritan or parable of the wicked servant. It's more of a question and get you to the answer quickly. And so there's not as much plot development normally in those. For example, you see in Matthew 11, verse 16, to what shall I liken this generation? See the same thing in Luke 7:31. In Matthew 21, verse 28, he's going to say, what do you think? And so these tend to set up a hypothetical situation to force the hearer and the reader to answer a question and obligate one to transfer the answer to another arena. So typically this kind of parable expects a negative answer. No one would act as a parable describes. So it's going to be used as a kind of like a negative. It's kind of like, and I view this particular one as being the one that God used. It wasn't a parable, but the way that God uses it anyways is his questions. And the very first incident with humanity at the fall, did God ask them a question? Remember what he asked Adam and Eve? What was it? Yeah. Who told you you were naked? Who told you about your eyes being open? Where'd you get all that stuff from? Now, that's not obviously a parable, but he's asking a question for contemplation, knowing that there's going to be a negative response to that. So I feel like when Jesus is asking these questions, it's going to be in the same kind of sphere as God was back in Genesis 3. It's more for contemplation than to give you information. But there are some interrogative parables. You see also there's now the double indirect narrative. So here's our word metaphor, told in the past tense. And so that might be dealing with another one might be dealing with the prodigal of the elder brother and the parable of the prodigal and the elder brother, how it's seen in the past tense. And so here's what they did. This is what happened. This is now how they came back. What do you think? And so and you have a big narrative there, don't you? And then also you have the banquet there, Luke 14. Another one might be judicial. Judicial is one that is going to be most forceful. And these are the ones that really are going to elicit self-condemnation from the hearer through the aid of an image. You see this in the Old Testament, where Nathan went to David after David had committed that sin with Bathsheba. And what did he say? Remember what parable he gave? The lamb. He says, if that man lost a lamb, another man came in and found it and killed it, what would you do? Would you be upset about it? And he said, oh, yeah, I would be. And so that's what you did to Bathsheba and to Uriah. And so Nathan's parable there back in 2 Samuel is seen as the closest parable in the Old Testament to what we find in the New Testament. But it's that kind of a judicial thing. It's making you actually be very forceful on. No, I feel like it's more trying to really get your heart moving. And so there are some judicial aspects here. You see this also in the two sons and Matthew 21, 32, the wicked tenants, Matthew 21, 33 to 45, about, the master forgave one, and that man went out and did not forgive the one who had given him less or had owed him less. Then the two debtors, Luke 7. And so all of these are designed to single out bad behavior. And so they're designed to really be corrective. And so therefore they're called judicial. Next area here is called single indirect, which presents either a positive or negative character who serves as an example. You see, these parables are saying go and perhaps do not do, likewise, like Luke 10:37. These parables are the Good Samaritan, the rich fool, rich man and Lazarus, Pharisees and the tax collector, parable of the unjust steward. And so these are not merely concerning seeds, treasures, masters, and servants. Rather, these are about God, his kingdom, and about how his people ought to believe. And then lastly, you have the much more than section. And so this is one that where you this is kind of what you may think of as a miscellaneous group, if you will. These ones may have some of the questions involved in them. These ones may lack plot development, while others might be more narrative with plot development. So you might see this in Luke 11:13, Matthew 7. Some would put in Matthew 7:24-27 to represent this one about the two builders. Some would say that might be a parable, depending on how you look at for your notes there. And so that's just a basic categorization there of the parables. And let me see if I go on here. Okay. There is a difference I'm going to go back here a minute. In a parable and an allegory. And I do think this is important because there are allegorical aspects to the parable, but a parable is not intended to be only an allegory. Okay? So, an allegory is defined as a series of related metaphors. Now, again, a parable will have allegorical aspects for sure, but it's not intended to only be an allegory. An allegory is just where you're going to say this thing represents this. Now, you do see that in some cases more than others. But you think about Galatians 4, verse 24, where Paul will go on to talk about Jews and Christians. He says that the Jews we'll talk about what will come from Hagar, and no, it's not. The Jews come from Isaac and Rebekah, and Hagar is the non-believers, and so that's all an allegory. He's going to say this is an allegory. So that's where he actually is saying here is one representation for this exact thing. He is presenting it as an allegory. Jesus' parables, though, I believe, have more force than a normal allegory. But we'll have some aspects of that. So there's some differences there. A very noted difference here inside of an allegory that might have been inside of our lifetime. How many of you know the movie or the book of The Wizard of Oz? Anyone know that story? Do you realize the whole thing is allegory? Don't know that? Oz, because that was back in the time when they were trying to establish the gold standard. And so Oz itself represents the ounce. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard. Scarecrow is the farmers. Tin Man is the industrial workers. And the Cowardly Lion represents the reformers, or in this case, it was the presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. All of that is seen as an allegorical thing. The parables are not going to be to that level. Now, there are some things about them, again, that do have aspects of it, but it's not intended to be only an allegory. Here I am. It's on my next page about the allegory from Paul, Hagar, Mount Sinai, Old Testament, Sarah, Jerusalem, New Testament. Here we go. Back in Galatians 4:24-31. So a parable, though, so an allegory has every detail corresponds to something else. A parable, though, each detail may not be necessarily significant. The details of a parable are the most often just to add color to the story, have been claimed by Lightfoot in his book on the parables. Now, next page, among the 40 some odd parables of Jesus, there are 6 main structures of said parables. Now, what these are, and you can read them on the board, 2/3 of Jesus' narrative parables presented 3 main characters or groups of characters in a triangular structure. The first one, again, you see that with the prodigal son. The triangular structure there would be the father, and then you kind of go down and you look at the elder brother, and you look at the prodigal, and the triangle is all about how they each relate to each other. You see that there are some issues going on between the elder brother and the younger brother, and then there's forgiveness of the father to the prodigal, and then the elder brother is one that says, how can you do this? Why didn't you give me the fatted calf? Why didn't you let me have all this merrymaking with my friends? And then the father relates to the older brother, and he says, because you're always with me. You always have these blessings and privileges anyways, but you are living beneath your privileges. And so he's trying to elaborate that more for the elder brother. And so you see that the triangular shape formed in that parable for an example. Another way might be the master figure. And this goes again with the king, father, landlord, shepherd, farmers. And these are all about interacting with or contrasting, in some cases, pairs of subordinates, like good and bad servants, sons, tenants, sheep, plants. When you look at the Matthew 25, verse 14, verse through 30, the master and his servants, and the parable of the talents, and one servant having being good, the other being bad. More often than not, there will be a reversal of kinds inside of the parables, where the normal guy that you would expect to be the hero of the story, Christ will use a reversal. He'll say, actually, it's supposed to be this action over here made by this man who might be an undesirable person, or might be one that you wouldn't have expected to come out. And so I think Jesus often will use kind of like the underdog story to be part of his parabolic teaching to some extent. Now, for this one, let me make sure. Well, it comes down in the fifth one there. But anyway, I'll mention it right now. So, like, for example, another one along the same lines about Christ using things kind of as a reversal. You think about the parable of the mustard seed, how it says it's the least of the herbs of the field, but when it grows and its branches become so big that even the birds can come and make their nests on it. Now, that is, and when you look at it, it would seem if you stopped at the beginning of it, what's the point of telling me about this small little bitty seed that's going to be the smallest of everything? Well, the reversal of it is because when it grows, it's going to be way bigger than what you ever would have thought came out of that little bitty seed. And so that represents, the church and how it's going to be all encompassing of the world and all those other good things. But we'll get there later. And so you see that kind of reversal there, but that's dealing with the one subject. When you look at this thing, also there's a triadic parable that may not have had a master, but may have had a unifying figure, like a judge between good and bad examples. And that might be the unifying figure. And the good one for this is the Good Samaritan, Luke 10:25-37. Two other instances, though, are more straightforward in a top-down vertical movement. This might be the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18:20-25, and the unjust steward, Luke 16. And so then the remaining 1/3 of the parables were split between 1 point and 2 points, such as parable of the unjust judge, Luke 18:1-8, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, Luke 18:9-14, and then the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. Another way that I've seen these things kind of put out, though, in a lot shorter order, is there are parables of the coming kingdom, the church. There are parables of loss and redemption, like Luke 15, lost sheep, coin, and sons. Parables about prayer, Luke 18:1. One's about forgiveness and compassion, Luke 18, about who is my neighbor, dealing with the Samaritan again. And then there are parables of eschatology, dealing with the end times, Matthew 25, and 10 virgins, talents, sheep, and goats. Now, that's a lot shorter structure that I found somewhere else. That was pretty good. Now, this one, you can see why I was trying to rush. Look at all that stuff. We can say amen and go on with it. But, parables. These are some basic characteristics of the parables. Okay? Number one, they are simple, straightforward. 33 parables are four verses or less. Very short, very sweet. There is symmetry here. Symmetry might be dealing with, again, the parable of the feast, where there are many guests who are invited. It only deals with 3 particular ones to represent the whole, how they had an excuse. I can't go because I got married, or I have to go look at a horse. I've got to go on a vacation, or whatever it may be for their excuse. Those are all very symmetrical to represent the whole. And so symmetry, though, is also shown in the unforgiving servant parable, Matthew 18, and the talents. It's very straightforward, easy. There is typically, outside of the mustard seed, a human element to the parables. There's always going to be a person working, looking, seeking somewhere in the parable. So there's always a human element. There is also a fictional description of everyday life element. For an example, in Matthew 18, verse 23-35, and the unforgiving servant who owed 10,000 talents. Well, that is, in our day and time, the equivalent to millions and millions of dollars. Now, from a historical standpoint, the governments of the world who had to pay tribute to Rome, they didn't even pay that much in tribute. And so here is a man who is who has a very, very bad credit history, who is very far in debt beyond his belief. He cannot pay it off in his lifetime. Can you imagine one man taking on the debt of a whole country by himself? Wouldn't that be phenomenal? And yet here the man is, he did it, and then he's forgiven of it. And so that's what's going on there inside of this fictional description here, that there are massive amounts of debt, but it's not at all an uncommon thing to have the debt, but he's going to use it to illustrate, to make more of a point that may not be more true to life. He's going to use it kind of as an extreme to show them what it looks like when you have to forgive somebody. How far would you go to forgive? I guess is really the point there. How far do you have to go to forgive? And so then you have that these also are designed to be engaging. 22 parables are dealing with questions. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you think? Or how? There are reversals. We've already gone through this a little bit. And so let me get my notes here. Yep. This forces unexpected decisions and associations. Like Good Samaritan, for example. I've said like 10 times already this one, but anyway. His main points come at the end, functioning as a punchline. They also, number 8, are told into their context. So there are, in one sense, realistic elements of the parables. He's not going to create his own world and say, if you're on the moon, what would you do with your cheese? You know, he won't use that because no one's going to understand what you're talking about with your cheese on the moon. How'd you get there and where's the cheese from? Why you got that? That makes no sense at all. So the whole thing is going to be very, very told in the context of their situation, wherever they may be at. One man says that sometimes, with that in mind, just having the extra sign here of being real, is that when he mentions a vineyard or a house, it can, in some cases, be taken in a literal sense, depending on the parable. There is going to be a theocentric element. God's going to be the center of this. And I also believe that the parables all have an underlying kingdom of heaven attribute somewhere in the parables. It's all going to be dealing with how you're going to behave in the church and as a citizen of his kingdom. And it's going to be something of that aspect in all the parables. There are going to be allusions to the Old Testament text in a lot of cases, which again, this connects up with the Jews. He's going to use a lot of stuff. And I found that one interesting because back in the very first, let's go back over here. Back in the very first slide, one of the things was about Jesus was that he didn't know what he was doing. He kind of came out of nowhere with these things. And even if he did, it wouldn't change any of them. But, one of the things was from this guy named Jeremiah, who said, not one single parable has come down to us from the period before Jesus. And yet, Christ is going to use things from the Old Testament to try to make sure that they don't miss it. You think about Nathan again. So Christ is going to make some allusions there to the Old Testament inside of his parables. You might use some things from Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Daniel or somebody else. Moses sometimes, depending on the parable. But then, let's look at here. There are going to be some things that appear in the middle of other parables, like Matthew 13, where you have a whole list of parables within other parables, where Christ is going to say, this is like this, take a break, look at this, and come back to another one. And so he's going to have a whole list of things that might be in other collections. And they never feature elements of myth or fantasy. A parable is an ingeniously simple word picture illuminating a profound spiritual lesson. And so he's not going to use a fable or a myth. He's not going to be like Aesop and try to explain a complete hypothetical that's never going to happen. He's not going to do that. He's always going to be very occupied with the spiritual aspect of the earthly story. He's very occupied with that. Now, I think, very good. I found, this is my work site, a summary. I'll just read you best as I can, clear as I can, a summary of all this stuff that we've talked about. I was told a long time ago that if you want to be a good presenter, you have to give your outline before, tell them, go along with it as you go, and tell them how you got there. So, as a summary to all this stuff, the clearness and concreteness of his method was another factor in Jesus being the incomparable teacher. He taught in such fashion as to fit perfectly his lesson to the person whom he was teaching. He taught new things in terms of old ones, in terms of things his auditors already knew. This method is called apperceptive, which entails a preparation, a comparison, presentation, generalization, and application. This method may be summed up saying this, that he will use something old already known to teach something new not known already. To do this, Jesus used the various phases such as pursuits and farming, fishing, cooking, buying land, to make clear the points in his spiritual lessons. He adapted his method to the particular person or group he wished to teach. By thus doing, he gained a point of contact and opened the way for the lesson he wished to teach. Also vital to his method was to use his questions. In one sense, he came to settle a man's mind, but in another sense, it came to unsettle those same minds. Although he was and is the Prince of Peace, it also is said of him that came not to bring peace but a sword. The idea of a sword is to make man unsettled in where they're at, to create a conflict that will make you move. And so in one sense, he came to answer man's questions. In another sense, he came not to answer man's questions, but to ask them. Not to save man from his problems, but to save them from their indolence. Not to make life easier, but to make it more educative. One man named Horn points out that the one reason Jesus used questions was to make his auditors think, and thus open the way for the lesson he wished to teach. Being simple and direct in his method, he often put his opponents in a dilemma by questions which forced them to face squarely the problem. He himself not only asked questions, but he also provoked his class to ask questions, thus leading them to face truth without having their feelings hurt. After making this point of contact, Christ would skillfully lead the conversation toward the great spiritual truths he wished them to learn. He used many concrete examples to teach the great lessons of trust. He placed a child midst of his disciples for one. He vitalized his lessons by telling them in such fashion as to make them fit the lives, needs, and interests of those he taught. His lucid statements held interest. His repetitions caused retention, and his illustrations and parables helped to explain. Now, that is what we would call our introduction to the parables. Isn't that one? 2 whole lessons? Look at that. Are there any questions? Is anybody lost in the parables of Jesus? Is anybody lost? Well, that's point number 1. Let's go back to point number 1. It's all over again. No. But it is interesting, though, because about this section, I'll say this. There are a lot of thoughts about this section. When you read any kind of books on the parable of Jesus, and by the way, last week I was asked for a good book or 2 about this for someone to read along with me. Now, I'm not using one particular book. I'm using the Bible, obviously, but I'm not using one particular book to go along with this. In all honesty, I'm using over probably 50 things. So I'm not going to give you all those things, okay? But what I'm saying is that if you want to look at any of this stuff on your own, if you want to look at a book on the parables, there are a few good ones around that are a lot shorter. The normal parable book from the church is like an 85-page book. Wayne Jackson has one called Parables in Profile. It's 85 pages. Neil Lightfoot. That's when I told the querist about my what I would do. I would use Neil Lightfoot. I think he does pretty fair with them. His book is called The Parables of Jesus. And then another guy named Eldred Eccles. He was a big guy up at Sunset for a little while. I think he died about 3 or 4 years ago. But anyway, he also wrote a good book on the parables of Jesus that he taught over in Africa a lot. But those three from the church, I think, are good. From those outside of a church, one of the better ones I've seen that's conservative, because like back at the very first slide, we had Jeremiah and Huliker and Scott and go on. Those guys are all skeptics. They don't believe anything about the parables. So from a conservative standpoint, for those outside the church, I would look at someone like Klein Snodgrass. I think he's a Baptist, but he's done considerable work in the parables. And so that's another good book. But that's probably the 4 I will look at primarily. If you want to look at anything, go to one of those 4 and you'll find anything you want in those pretty well. Another thing, though, about these, inside of this section here, about the names, is that sometimes as we go into the class, I might have a different change of names on some of the parables. I was actually reading one of the skeptics, who is B.B. Scott. He's a skeptic. He doesn't believe all of them are real with Jesus. But he makes a very fair comment. And he said that when you name the parable, you may take away the other important aspects of the parable. And so his example was that when you name the parable of the prodigal son, if you think about just the name of it there, you may not even consider that there might be another person inside of the parable dealing with the elder brother. And so what he says to do, and I think it's pretty smart, is instead of doing that, what he says, just uses the first line of the verse, and that way that you're not going to give a prior perception on this parable. You're going to let it talk for itself, which I thought was pretty fair. So I might do that sometimes. Let's make you all aware at the introduction here before I go into that. But I thought that was a pretty fair comment to make. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments about any of this stuff? What you got?
Third reference you gave, Nichols' first name.
Eldred. Let me. That's why I did this. Eldred, Eldred Eccles, Eldred Eccles, Echols. And his book is called Discovering the Pearl of Great Price, The Parables of Jesus.
So the parable, so the part would be the lost son.
Yeah. So like what?
That makes sense because prophet was not a
Right. Yeah, and that was his whole thing. His whole thing was that a lot of times when you name them, you've already given away, and you've already kind of created a barrier to what the parable could be saying, instead of actually letting the parable speak for itself. Which I thought that was a fair comment. But yeah, so for example, he doesn't even give them names in his book. All thing he does is he just goes through and he says, just pick out one. So he'll go to like Matthew 23 or 24, and instead of like it being a parable of the goats and the sheep, he'll say something, or the vineyard. What he'll say is, 25 verse 1, he'll say this parable here will be dealing with, parable is so instead of saying parable of the wise and foolish virgins, he'll say, for his comment, then the kingdom of heaven should be like 10 virgins. And that's his title. Instead of it being foolish and wise, he's going to say that's the title for them. And then here's what it's about those 10 virgins. So that way, his whole mentality is that way you don't put your bias on the parable. But anyway, okay. Are there any other questions? If you want, I've written down 20 things I do use most consistently. So if you want to have this for your own stuff, you can. That's why I have it separated for you to have a copy. But, okay, well, I'm going to stop class. I've only got 2 minutes left. And so next week, we're going to start in the very first parable of Jesus. And I'm going to let you find out what that is. That'll be a good homework, wouldn't it? And then next week, Lord willing, we'll come back for that. Thank you for being in class today. Thank you for letting me ramble on. But we finished, didn't we? And so we'll have church here in a few minutes.